In this tutorial, I'll walk you through the process of creating clothing simulations. Before we begin, let's prepare the required files. You'll need two files. The first is a rigged clothing skeletal mesh FBX. The second is an FBX containing the same rig with an additional proxy mesh. Let's take a look at the first file. As you can see, this is the original clothing mesh with its rig already completed. Now let's look at the second file. It has the same structure, but includes an additional proxy mesh. The most important requirement is that the original clothing mesh and the proxy mesh must share the exact same rig. In other words, they must have identical skin weights. As you can see, both mesh deforms and move exactly the same way. Now let's talk about the proxy mesh. The original clothing is typically a high poly mesh with a lot of detail. The proxy mesh, on the other hand, is a simplified, low poly version with unnecessary details and thickness removed. You can think of it as a mesh created specifically to make skinning and clothes simulation easier. The original garment has thickness, while the proxy mesh does not. There's one more important thing to keep in mind. For example, if the original clothing includes inner shorts, the proxy mesh must also include the same inner shorts. We'll go over this again during the actual workflow. Let's look at a few examples. The first mesh is the original clothing, and the second is the proxy mesh. Notice that the stepped details have been removed, the topology has been simplified, and the edge flow has been cleaned up to make skinning easier. The mesh thickness has also been removed, while the inner shorts has been preserved. Here's another example. This shows how a high poly garment has been simplified into a low poly proxy mesh. Finally, here's one more example. The first mesh is the original clothing. Small details such as straps has been removed, leaving only the parts that actually need clothes simulation. In this shirt, only the lower section will be simulated, so the rest has been removed, and only required area has been converted into a proxy mesh. The same principle applies to the skirt. Only the portion that will receive clothes simulation needs to be included in the proxy mesh. Once your files are prepared, you're ready to move on to the ModKit. Now, let's move into the ModKit. For this tutorial, we'll use adult female dress 01 as our example outfit. First, create a new clothing mod project. I'll skip ahead through the project creation process. Next, we need to import the FBX file we prepared earlier. Using the resource tool, import the FBX that contains both the skeletal mesh outfit and the proxy mesh. Once the import is complete, the skeletal mesh will appear in the project. If you're using your own custom clothing, You'll need to prepare your own material separately. Since this is a simple outfit, we'll use the materials already included in the ModKit. Apply the material to the clothing mesh. Before we start the clothes simulation, let's briefly go over the physics asset. Avatar physics asset can be found under Content, Character, Avatar Parts, Body, Gender, Mesh. Inside the folder, you'll find several physics assets. The base physics asset contains collision bodies for the entire character. The clothes physics asset excludes the arm collisions. This version is typically used for skirts and other garments where arm collisions aren't necessary. There's also a hair physics asset that's intended for hair simulation. You're also free to create your own custom physics asset if needed. Now let's create the clothes simulation data. Instead of using original clothing mesh, right-click the proxy mesh. Go to Create Clothing Data from section, then select the Clothes Physics asset. The clothing data will now be created. At this point, it's only generated for LOD0. Right-click the proxy mesh again. Choose Clothing LOD from section, select the existing clothing data, and create LOD1. Make sure to enable the remap option before creating it. Once that's done, all work on proxy mesh is complete. Now disable the Lambert1 material assigned to the proxy mesh so it is no longer visible. Next, switch back to the original clothing mesh. Under LOD0, right-click and choose Apply Clothing Data to assign the clothes simulation data. Repeat the same process for LOD1 using the clothing data we just created. Now both LOD0 and LOD1 have this clothes simulation applied. Next, under LOD0, select the original clothing mesh and click Close Paint. You'll now see proxy mesh that we created earlier. This is where you'll paint simulation weights. Be careful not to paint the weight too strongly. If the values are too high, the clothing may penetrate the character's body during simulation. Start by painting the lower portion of garment with moderate values. How you create the proxy mesh can make the weight painting process much easier. Once you finish painting, switch to the smooth tool. Set the strength to 1 and smooth out the painted areas. At this point, the initial weight painting is complete. If you play the simulation, you'll see the clothes begin to move naturally. Now, let's talk about the inner shorts. In this example, the areas painted pink have a simulation value of 0, meaning close simulation is disabled in those regions. As the color becomes closer to white, the simulation weight increases. If you look at the inner shorts, you'll notice that they are painted entirely with a value of 0. Since the inner shorts should never be simulated, their simulation weight must remain at 0. Now imagine the original garment didn't include a inner shorts mesh. If the simulation weights on the outer garment extended all the way upwards, there would be nothing to define a 0 weight region for the inner area. As a result, the simulation weights from the outer garment would also affect the inside of the clothing. This would cause the inner mesh to deform or even tear during simulation. That's why, if the original garment include inner shorts, you should also include them in the proxy mesh and paint their simulation weight to 0. This is a very important step for achieving stable clothes simulation. Now let's restore the original weight painting. Next, we'll configure the clothes simulation settings. These settings can be found in Chaos Clothes Config. As you can see, there are many different parameters available, including mass properties, material properties, stretch properties, collision properties, environment properties, animation properties. If you're new to clothes simulation, the settings can seem overwhelming. A good way to get started is to use the sample assets provided with the ModKit. Apply the same values from the same sample assets, then run a few tests and adjust them as you need it. Now let's take a look at one of the most important settings, anim drives. As you can see, the current value is 0. When anim drive is set to 0, the clothes follows the simulation completely. Let's preview the simulation. If we move the character, you'll notice that the clothes swings very aggressively. This is because it ignores the bone skin weights and relies entirely on the clothes simulation. Now let's change the values to 1. With anim drive set to 1, the clothes follows the bone skin weight completely instead of the simulation. Anim drive allows you to control the balance between animation and clothes simulation. For example, setting it to 0.5 blends the two together, allowing the cloth to follow the animation while it reacts naturally to the simulation. In most cases, this is one of the most important parameters you'll adjust. After you've finished tuning the other clothes settings, come back and fine-tune the anim drive value. You also want to adjust anim drive damping. This controls how smoothly the clothes transitions between the animation and simulation, so choose the value that produces the most natural result for your garment. Next, let's look at the collision settings. If the collision values are set too high, the cloth will be pushed outwards like this. You can adjust the collision settings to achieve the result you're looking for. For this tutorial, will simply match the settings used in the sample outfit. Once you've adjusted the values, move the character around a bit to test the simulation. After you're satisfied with the result, you can temporarily hide the bones to make the mesh easier to inspect. At this point, the weight paint has only been applied to LOD0. If you switch to LOD1, you'll notice that the weights haven't been transferred yet. To copy them over, right-click LOD1 and select Rebuild Asset Parameter Mask. This will transfer the same weight paint settings to LOD1. Make sure that LOD0 and LOD1 always use identical weight paint settings. Then save your changes. Before finishing, perform one final verification to make sure everything has been applied correctly. Under LOD0, open the clothing section for the material assigned to the garment and verify that the clothing data is applied. Repeat the same check for LOD1. If the Remove Clothing Data option is available, it means the clothing data has been applied successfully. You can also switch back to LOD0 and verify that the clothing data is assigned correctly there as well. Once all of the step is complete, there is one final step you shouldn't skip. Earlier, we've imported an FBX that contained both the original garment and the proxy mesh. Now, re-import the skeletal mesh using a new FBX that contains only the final garment without the proxy mesh. After the re-import, you'll notice that the proxy mesh material is no longer present. The clothing simulation will still be applied correctly. If you see a message indicating that the skeletal mesh data has changed, simply click OK to continue. At this point, you can also rename the asset to remove any references to the proxy mesh. Now the clothing asset is complete. Open the clothing wizard, add your clothing asset, and assign a thumbnail if you have one. Then review the remaining settings such as the character's gender, age group, material assignments, and any other required options. Once everything has been verified, package the mod. After launching the game, enable your newly created mod from the Mods menu. In this example, we created a female outfit, so open the clothing setting and equip the newly added mod. If everything was set up correctly, you'll see that the clothes simulation is working as expected. This completes the clothing simulation tutorial.